So Oath of Moment is confirmed to be nerfed. Seems like Blood Angels and Dark Angels and friends will be able to play with the new Space Marines detachments. And we've got a bunch of rules reveals from the First Company Task Force plus the Firestorm Assault Force, the detachment that seems to be tailor-made for Salamanders and transports. Let's talk about the massive previews that Games Workshop just dropped for Codex Space Marines. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're going over Games Workshop's latest rules preview for Codex Space Marines. Looks like this is the first really big preview of what's going to be coming in the new book, and as you'd expect, they really focus around their detachments and the new ways to play Space Marines, very much feeling like the most exciting thing that they'll add for the Codex. The fact that we're getting pretty big previews this week does likely mean that the Codex, I suspect, will be announced at the end of the week. I guess it's not 100% guaranteed, and Games Workshop often do have delays and things, but my guess would be we'll probably get the Codex announcement on Sunday the 24th, the pre-order going live on Saturday the 30th with a bunch of previews dropping then, and then if that turns out to be true, I guess that will be full sale for the Codex on the 7th of October or thereabouts. Obviously a little bit speculative at this point, but I feel like that'd be the most likely, maybe the week after, if not this week though. For this one, Games Workshop's gone over a bunch of different detachment rules. They basically showed us off 2 new ones and about half of the Imperial Fist one as well, though it does seem that literally everything that they showed off has basically fit perfectly with that prior leak that we had a few days back, including things like that rumoured change to Oath of Moment, plus the teased rules for the Imperial Fist detachment rule. I did think that past leak was pretty odds on to be right, but this does seem to add a lot more credence to that. Probably gives us high chance of suspecting that all those teased things will turn out to be accurate. In this preview though, there really is quite a lot to unpack. Let's start with Oath of Moment and the implications for the Divergent Chapters, and then go through all the detachment rules they've previewed for the Firestorm Assault Force, First Company Strike Force, and the Anvil Siege Force. As they mentioned before, themed to certain chapters but not necessarily locked to them, so it doesn't matter what colour the Space Marines are painted. First up, and perhaps the biggest news, is the confirmation that Oath of Moment is confirmed to be nerfed. This one was perhaps one of the more surprising rumours that came out of that previous leak. It's basically saying that the Oath of Moment would now be changed to just reroll hits against the listed target, but you wouldn't be able to get the reroll wound rolls anymore. Basically, this is a very direct and really quite powerful nerf to Space Marines overall, and in particular it's going to give them a little bit more trouble than they had previously of focusing down really big tough threats, which seemed to be kind of like their signature move from the Index, given the Oath of Moment power. I did think that when Oath of Moment came out it was a bit of a strange rule, very helpful against any army that just had an enormous great big tanky unit as a centerpiece in their battle line, making those ones just weirdly easy to kill, and in particular making anything with either devastating wounds or sort of mid-strength firepower like say plasma really quite good at taking down hard targets. As it's turned out for Space Marines in the meta, it doesn't really seem to have been too problematic. Space Marines have sort of been lower mid for the majority of 10th edition so far. They might potentially be rising up a little bit after the balanced data slate, I guess, and some of the top armies being toned down. I feel like most people would probably see the Oath of Moment change as perhaps a somewhat needless one. I'd guess that seeing as the Games Workshop's codexes were printed a while back, they'll have basically made this decision quite a while ago, maybe when 10th edition had either just come out or a bit before that. So it's not like it's just something that they've decided over the last few weeks or anything like that. This will have had to have been a decision made in advance. It'll be interesting to see how they work out balancing this. It'll definitely be a cut to Space Marine power in general, and also I guess to all the Divergent chapters that light Oath of Moment, things like Death Watch and Space Wolves and Blood Angels and friends. Though they did say that there would be a few other opportunities to get full wound rerolls within the Codex, which hadn't previously been possible. I'd guess for that they'd probably mainly mean character buffs, seeing as any individual stratagem would just be locked to detachment, or I suppose they could flex some units around to try and allow that, say things like the Storm Speeder debuffs maybe. It would also mean that Oath of Moment will be kind of worthless for torrent weapons unless they put a specific line of text including that. So far they haven't actually shown us off the entire rule, just a little bit of free text. Overall, definitely not much of a feel-good change there. I did kind of like the way that it would just let Space Marines just bring an obscene amount of damage. It definitely doesn't seem to have worked out quite as problematic as I was kind of concerned that it might have done when the rule was first released. I guess it might come hand in hand with some Marines datasheets going down in points. It is perhaps a little bit of a weird rule to balance, given that it's just very powerful against some armies, but maybe less so against others. Will be interesting to see where the entirety of Marines shake out once we have the full rules. Another thing that was maybe a bit of a soft preview is they confirmed that there are lore segments and things for Dark Angels, Blood Angels, and the Divergent Chapters within the book. It sounds like for Codex Space Marines it might still be the same offering, a core codex with the majority of units in, and then indexes and supplements for the unique chapter units. We do know that there's a codex coming for Dark Angels in spring this year. That would imply that it seems at least fairly likely that the Divergent chapters like that might again need 2 books to make up their entire army, much in the same way as you have 2 indexes right now. While it's probably bad news for them that Oath of Moment is getting toned down, if they are being in major lore sections of the book, then I would guess that this probably means that they get to use all the detachments within Codex Space Marines. So if it made sense, you might be able to have a first company task force for Dark Angels and maybe build around their Deathwing. Or maybe the White Scar style detachment with the advance and charge that we saw the other day. That feels like it could be a fairly good one for Space Wolves maybe. Again, maybe a little bit weird how they might be balancing these, if most of these armies get access to the full units from Codex Space Marines, plus a bunch of their own interesting stuff that all seems to have gone down in points a bit. It's maybe kind of hard to see how they might not just turn into Space Marines Plus if they do just have the full pick of the detachments, even if their own unique detachments for a fair few of them seem somewhat tame at the moment. Getting into Games Workshop's proper detachment previews though, first up we had some details for the First Company Task Force. This is the one that's not really themed around any one chapter, but just more sort of a force to represent Terminators and veterans taking to the field. It seems that their detachment rule is called Extremist Level Threat, and I feel like this again probably isn't going to be a massively feel-good one, as it's a once per game return of old Oath of Moment rules, with both the full reroll to hit and the full reroll to wound against your one selected Oath target. That fits in well with that leak snippet that we had to say that the First Company Task Force would have some sort of wound reroll buff for that. But overall, I feel like if you're looking from a Space Marine perspective at the moment, it's not going to be quite as exciting. Basically, if you're running Veterans and Terminators at the moment you could run them in a Gladius company and get the full Oath of Moment all game long right now. If you run them in this detachment, then you basically get Oath of Moment but worse than it is now, and also lose all the combat doctrines. I must admit it doesn't really feel like a very good start for this detachment to basically have Oath of Moment but worse than now. And while having one turn of Old Oath is definitely powerful, whether or not it's quite enough to justify losing combat doctrines for those 3 turns of the game might be another question. It is quite good for some of the veterans though, would work quite well with Stern Guard with their devastating wounds I suppose. Otherwise, for the support rules, we've seen one of the 4 enhancements and one of the 6 stratagems. The enhancement is Iron Resolve. This one gives you a 5+ Feel No Pain type save for the bearer, and once per game you get to flex into a 5+ Feel No Pain for their lead unit for one phase. Potentially that really is quite powerful if you've got a big nasty unit of veterans of some sort charging down the enemy, and then they're about to take some hefty damage in reprisal for a turn. Seems like that could be pretty excellent for something like a Terminator squad on the front lines maybe. They've teleported in, maybe used rapid ingress or something, and then done a whole bunch of damage, and they're just about to get hit back really hard. If it's costed right, then that one does seem very usable. Otherwise, for 1 CP, there's one called Legendary Fortitude. This one is locked to a Veterans unit, Terminator Blade Guard, Stern Guard, or Vanguard, and it's basically a -1 to enemy damage in combat when you get charged. I guess that means that's a situation where the opponent's usually going to be striking first unless you've got any sort of fights first or can interrupt. It means that you are likely to be taking meaningful damage before you get to hit back, and for 1 CP to potentially save a few Space Marines against something nasty, that one could well be worth it. Seems like quite a powerful tool, and if a fair few of the stratagems are locked to that subset of units, I guess that would really just incentivize you to take as many of them as possible. Definitely a handy tool to have in the toolbox. I guess we'll have to take it in context of what all the other stratagems are and whether the overall support seems to be worth it or not. Next up, we also got some previews for Salamanders and Imperial Fists. The Salamanders themed detachment, as we heard from before, is the Firestorm Assault Force one, and as we'd heard from the rumours, it does indeed seem to be something that's both themed for Salamanders sort of theming, but also really quite focused on transport vehicles as well, so it could be pretty applicable to any Space Marine mechanised infantry force. It definitely feels like a close range shooting style detachment, and I do quite like its detachment rule as it gives your firepower units all game buffs. Ranged weapons all get the assault keyword all game long, which I think is really quite big. Basically every single time you're repositioning a gunline unit, you can get to advance provided you're not charging. That really is very handy for getting to objectives, getting line of sight or getting range on the enemy. An extra d6-inch movement for all your firepower units all the time is pretty awesome. Then on top of that there's a further boost for anything that you're firing within 12-inch range, plus 1 strength to your attack there. In some cases that's going to be pretty awesome, in some cases a bit lackluster. It's going to be entirely dependent on what sort of targets are in your opponent's army and whether that +1 strength actually translates to a +1 to wound or not. I guess it's going to be most useful on any close range weapons. If you are sticking with thinking about Salamanders, which do tend to have a fair few close range things, could be very nice for +1 strength on Infernus Marines to get them up to strength 6. Wounding toughness 3 on 2s and toughness 5 on 3s are both good, and the assault keyword might let the shorter range things get in range as well. For melter weapons, say Eradicators or Multi-Melter Devastators getting within 12 inches, they ideally want to be getting into melter range anyway, and that might put the melter guns up to strength 10, which is really quite a big breakpoint for a fair few heavily armoured targets in the game. Wounding a mainline battle tank on a 4+ rather than a 5+ is quite a big jump. Overall this one seems fun, seems like quite a good core detachment rule. Beyond that though, we got a few other teasers. In the article they also told us about an enhancement called a War-Tempered Artifice. This one's a fun upgrade for a commander, giving you +3 to the strength of their melee weapons in combat. Could have things like Power Fist punching up on a strength 11 or something like that. Again, getting up to the breakpoint when you're wounding vehicles on 4s or 3s I think is well worth it, obviously provided it's costed appropriately. Entirely dependent on whether or not it's got a very hefty price tag or not though. Otherwise, previewed in their video going alongside things, there's a 1 command point stratagem for a fun one called Burning Vengeance. This one's quite a powerful stratagem I think. If an enemy unit shoots a transport in their shooting phase, then your squad can immediately disembark and make a shooting attack against that same enemy unit as if it were your shooting phase. Kind of an interesting one in that it both gets you essentially a little bit of movement and an entire turn's worth of firepower out of one unit. I feel like between those two effects you could have quite a lot of value out of it, and I feel like that's just a very good disruptive one to have for a mechanised Space Marine force. It could have your opponent second guessing whether or not they even want to shoot transports if they can afford to take the counter attack. You do have the potential to wipe out entire enemy units in your own turn there. Could be nice for things like Flamestorm aggressors in a Land Raider taking some close range firepower maybe. Or perhaps things like Hellblasters in an Impulsor, you could have them jump out and shoot the enemy target and put down a whole bunch of wounds on them. Could be relevant for objectives as well, maybe standing your squad and putting a few more bodies where they're needed, though bear in mind that if you do disembark from the transport, if the opponent's got any other firepower, they could just target your unit directly and not bother with firing at the transport anymore. Otherwise, from their teaser video, they also had a couple of very partial stratagem reveals that were slightly annoying but interesting. There was about half the text revealed for one of them, which sounds like it's some kind of re-embark stratagem, something that sounds like it's going to allow you to re-embark back into your transport at an unusual time out of sequence. We don't know the fine print on that yet though. Definitely seems handy for mechanised infantry forces to have, could maybe set you up for some better movement in the next turn, or keep your unit safe depending on when it triggers. There was also something that seems to trigger Battle Shock as well, though it's a stratagem that's only got the last line or two revealed, so it might well have other effects. Next up, we also saw some teasers from the Anvil Siege Force, so this would be the Imperial Fists version. This one we saw about 90% of the core detachment rule, but we're missing the last line. It does seem to be entirely consistent with the leaked version though, which means that all weapons in your army get heavy, so +1 to hit if they're stationary, and then the rest of the text basically read that you get a further benefit if heavy weapons remain stationary, though it just cut off a bit before we could see what it was. If we're going by the leaks, then that would be that +1 to wound that was rumoured for heavy weapons if they're static. Could be very nice for things like large cannon devastators sitting around and gunning down enemy tanks, or particularly for things like whirlwinds firing indirect. They're often some of the best beneficiaries of these kind of rules, as artillery generally doesn't have to move to reposition anyway, because it's not like they're looking for lines of sight. Seems overall interesting, the movement's quite a big deal in Warhammer 40k, and having the choice between actually getting to move or not using your detachment rule is quite a painful trade-off. Otherwise, they showed off at least one of their enhancements in full, which is one called Indomitable Fury for Gravis models. This one's one of those abilities that allows you to return to the battle from death once you're slain the first time. Roll a dice and on a 2+, you get to set up with your 4 wounds remaining at the end of the phase. I feel like these rules have the potential to be very powerful, though you are kind of gambling on your unit getting killed for them to have any effect, which often isn't the best case of affairs in the first place. I suppose if you're playing very aggressively with something like some aggressors jumping out of a Land Raider with a captain in tow, then this seems pretty reasonable to have on the captain, as they might well be taking a bunch of firepower. Having a Gravis captain stand up in the middle of the enemy army and hopefully getting an entire turn left to shoot and fight after that is quite big. With 4 wounds remaining, that is coming back with really quite a lot of wounds, and they are fairly hard to take down in the first place. As with all the enhancements, it's going to depend on just how much points it costs. Otherwise, there was a partial reveal for something called Fleet Commander as well, some kind of orbital bombardment style rule that's declared in the shooting phase once per game. Looks like it's going to be one of the ones where you nominate a point on the board from your commander, though the rule cuts off before we get the full text of it. It's not clear whether or not the opponent's going to have the chance to run out the way of it, or whether or not it's just going to be some direct damage then and there. Otherwise, from the previous leaks that we had a few days back, there were a few other stratagems teased. 1 CP for Battle Drill Recall, which would gain you critical hits on a 5+ if you're static, and also give you sustained hits 1 on your weapons as well. For 1 CP, that does seem like really quite a nice one for essentially a 40% damage boost if you were stationary, and I feel like that's almost an auto-use one each turn if you've got a big scary firepower unit that can afford to stay still. Otherwise, there was one for 2 CP called Hail of Vengeance for a return fire type mechanic that triggers if your squad loses a model. Again, could be worth it situationally for a return volley of firepower. It really depends on how many casualties you've taken and how much threat your squad has, and how important it is to get damage on the enemy unit then and there. Finally, there was an enhancement called Architect of War, a nice simple leadership ability to allow a squad to ignore cover, supposedly around about 20 to 30 points. Overall, does seem like fairly interesting support for a gunline style army. I feel like it might be one that's a bit terrain dependent though. If you're playing on more casual tables without very much terrain density, then it might well do better, at least compared with certain competitive boards where you've got lots of line of sight blocking and things, and you might be less likely to be able just to stay stationary and shoot. Finally, for the one that we already know, they did confirm that the Gladius task force will still be in the book. From the brief rules preview of that, it looked like nothing had really changed too much. They've still got combat doctrines, and it looks like at least 2 of the enhancements are entirely unchanged. The Artificer armor for 2+ save and 5+ feel no pain, and Honor Vehement for extra attacks, and +2 to strengthen attack if you're in the Assault doctrine. As rumoured from the previous leaks as well, they did confirm that all the detachments will get the Armour of Contempt stratagem as well. That appears to be unchanged from their preview, still a battle tactic stratagem, so useful for your captains and things. And they say in the article that it's basically going to be a Space Marine signature move, so I'd guess that's going to be one of the stratagems available to probably every single Space Marine detachment in the game. In any case, some pretty fun stuff there. I feel like from these previews, perhaps the one that I'm most interested in is the Salamanders and Transport style detachment. That does seem really quite fun for close range fire support units jumping in and out of transports, and just being kind of handy for gun lines in general, getting them around the board. Space Marines do seem to have a fair few efficient transports now between impulsors, repulsors and land raiders. I could see that one being fairly good. Obviously hard to weigh that up without the full rules though, and apparently Games Workshop are going to be teasing a few more of these other detachment rules later in the week, so I look forward to taking a look at those when they pop up. Let me know your thoughts though, and if you've enjoyed the video then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming on the channel, and I'll cover any more news that we get of the Space Marine Codex, either from Games Workshop or through leaks. Looking forward to reviewing the Space Marine book in full once we get it of course. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos quite a bit on the channel, then I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.